Hello, class. I just wanted to talk a little bit about Chapter 6 and the idea of the connection between healing and religiosity, and kind of hitting on some of the themes we talked about regarding shamanism and early traditions, early religions, indigenous cultures, and then a lot of those topics. So anyway, chapter 6 kind of, gives you the bigger picture that the supernatural and supernatural belief and rituals are interconnected with wellness and healing and the idea of diagnosis and an overall well-being. So there's kind of this mind-body-spirit connection that we in the West maybe are starting to put a greater attention to and focus to, and not solely looking at science or Western medicine as the solution to everything. One of the things we have to think about when we talk about these topics is that not only can supernatural be a aid in healing and wellness, but also could be the cause of illness. And so there's a recognition as well in many places in the world that the spirit world can cause illness as well, and that humans can be imbued with supernatural power, whether it's negative energy or ritualistic behavior that might cause illness as well. So when we talk about magical practices, magic in the context of healing, but also magic in the context of doing harm. And another kind of overall theme of the chapter to kind of think about is this idea of the placebo effect. How the recognition or the belief in a entity, a spirit, a being, a practice that causes healing might in fact be the end result of healing. And so that idea of managing stress through religious practice and ritual and healing in that context as well becomes a part of the discussion. In many cultures, religious activities are tied to healing, whether it's prayer and religious speech, whether it's actual rituals, whether it's the use of traditional plants as medicines. There is some kind of intersection with that understanding. In these situations, usually healers and patients have positive expectations and things will work out. Usually there is a lot of respect, and the healer is often someone that is regarded as knowledgeable, charismatic. I guess what I could say with regards to Western traditions is that they would have a good bedside manner, which I think Western practitioners of medicine might not always have that. Another key theme, if you haven't noticed this with the chapter and the book in general, is the idea that the social group is important. That part of the context of religiosity in any chapter we're talking about is that intersection, that being part of the social community, of a social group, is beneficial to us as humans, and really for all primates, human and non-human primate, that has also contributed to our success. So the healing can come through a variety of means, whether it's the idea of rituals through community bonding and support, whether it might be through movement, music. The shamanism chapters and discussions brought in a lot of discussion with dance and drumming. You even saw this in some of your religious sites visits, that the idea of rhythm music is tied to not only religious ritual, but in many times, aiding in a sense of well-being. That might kind of also interact with the idea of relaxation techniques. Think of Reiki healing or meditation. So all these things we can find in very different examples cross-culturally. So quick examples here, thinking about dance. Lord Krishna, one of the major deities in Hinduism, a lot of worship and healing with Krishna is often interpreted through movement, through dance, through rhythm. The example of the Korean shaman, the Mudang, a female shaman who has learned to heal through overcoming their own illness, and much of the healing rituals are often tied with movement and dance. And then finally, an example that we saw earlier in the semester with Italian tarantismo, the healing, the psychological well-being of a woman through dance and movement. So we'll switch gears a little bit here and focus on a topic I think that's interesting to many of us, is that intersection of ethnobotany. So once again, another theme in our text is that idea of intersecting biology and culture, the biocultural approach, somewhat similar in the context of talking about plants and people. So remember that root ethno refers to culture or group or people, and the botany side of it is connecting to plants or the study of plants. So an ethnobotanist might be a subfield of anthropology, an anthropologist who is specifically looking at how people use plants, how indigenous cultures might have that unique knowledge. And that might be using plants for foods, of course, but also medicinal purposes, clothing, using plants in aiding and assisting in making hunting more beneficial. I think I used the example of the hoodea plant, which is often used as an appetite suppressant in long hunts and making teas out of that cactus. And of course, plants being used in religious ceremonies, whether they be inducing altered states of consciousness and having psychedelic effects, or in the context of a communal type of feast. So plants really important. So we also discussed this probably a couple weeks back, looking at how anthropology helps us understand the use of medicinal plants and whether it's primatology and observing wild animals and how they might use plants that have chemical compounds that might be interpreted as being positive and wellness inducing, looking at past human behaviors, and we'll look at some various cultures that have had a connection to healing and their practices, and obviously modern cultures and human behavior, and looking at how healing and wellness might be associated not only with people, but certain ritual practices, certain places as well. So in prehistory, we see a lot of examples where plants in general have been a source of healing. This is Otzi. He was one of the naturally mummified individuals from prehistory, from the Neolithic, going back to over 5,000 years ago. And many interpretations of who Otzi was. He's named Otzi for the Otzal Mountains, where he was found on the border of Italy and Austria. But one of the reasons why he's so interesting is not only do we see a lot of clues into the Neolithic life, but also there's interpretations that he might have been a shaman or a healer, because he did have plants that had qualities that were used for medicinal purposes. And so you can kind of start to interpret that, was this everyday use, or was this somebody that had a little bit more knowledge? In ancient civilizations where we have recorded records, whether in hieroglyphs or actual texts, we can see going back 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years ago, different traditions where you have the medicinal use of plants and healing, going back to Ayurvedic traditions tied to early Indian cultures, many practices that you see today, of course, in ancient China as well, many practices tied to medicinal Chinese herbs and plants, and also pressure, acupressure, and acupuncture as well. So when we look at healing plants, we see that the World Health Organization estimates that 80% of people rely on plant-based medicines for their primary care. And we often think about our own medicinal pharmaceuticals being based on chemical compounds coming from plants. So we see this important in the indigenous world and also in the modern world. Some of the ones that you might be familiar with, looking at quinine for treating malaria. We look at the opium poppy, which has ultimately brought in other problems in terms of addiction, and of course willow bark as traditional aspirin. And a lot of you had a lot of suggestions of your own when we had discussed this in class a couple weeks ago. Here's another example. The Chinese star anise fruit is the basis for Tamiflu, which was very popular coming with the flu season. And here is an example on the left of the hoodea plant that's often used by African hunters and gatherers to suppress hunger, so the one that I had mentioned earlier. So finally, as we get into wrapping this up, the ideas of ethnobotany usually are associated with Harvard professor Richard Evans Schultes, who did a lot of work in South America with the Yukuna indigenous peoples and collecting and documenting a lot of the plants that they used in the Amazonian rainforest. And so the rainforest is an area that, of course, you can imagine the multitude of plants, but also the people that live in these jungle environments where they have the knowledge of how the plants are used. During Schultes' work, he collected over 30,000 plants, and there's still that dire kind of urgency to learn more about the plants and what there is to discover even today, many years later. Your video link that you'll be watching is a TED Talk and then a short excerpt of a film called The Shaman's Apprentice. This is one of Schultes' students, Mark Plotkin, who has worked in the Amazonian rainforest to preserve plant and people knowledge. So I'll leave you with that information. I thank you for watching. Please watch the links that I have posted on the Canvas module, and I will see you guys soon. Thank you very much. Have a great night, day, whenever you're watching this. Bye.